So, hope you're doing all right. We're continuing our series, Living God's Love, the idea of really spiritual practices within this concept or this setting of it's a relational, there are mechanisms or means or ways to develop, to nurture the relationship we have with God and the relationship we have with others through these practices. And so we're approaching it kind of with that foundational understanding. And we're walking through several of them, right? Every class we have a particular practice, and then we kind of give a setting for it. We give a theological foundation and unpack it a little bit. And then I leave you with a suggestion of how to go out and put it in practice. Then hopefully you go out and put it in practice. Last time we talked about the idea of Shabbat, right? The idea of the Sabbath rest, how it's not just resting, which is an important part of it, but it's really living out an existence that reflects through our practices the concept of peace, God's rest, God's presence, and how we need to incorporate that in the rhythms of our lives, which can include moments of rest. But just how we approach relationships, how we approach work, how we approach just the day in and day out of busyness, all has to be this concept of Shabbat. I think part of the practice or the practical aspect of it was maybe to make a list of some things that you can try to incorporate in your day, in your week, kind of on a monthly setting. Anybody want to share any idea or thought you had about any one of those particular ways or practices or ways to incorporate Shabbat in your life?
I rationalized that I can be busy, but still Shabbat.
Yeah, that's very good example of rationalization right there. Yes, you've recognized one of the obstacles that we face is rationalizing our busyness. Anybody else want to confess anything?
I took multiple naps.
There you go, yeah. And if anybody pushed back, you'd be like, my spiritual advisor recommended it's part of, yeah. There you go. Good. All right, so today we're going to talk about different spiritual practice. And once again, I hope that some of the practices we're describing might be a little out of the list you would have made, right? Most of us, I think, would have thought of things like prayer, reading the scripture, attending services, maybe acts of service. But I'm hoping to broaden your understanding of these practices because I think they're broader than most of us realize. So today we're going to talk about relating with God through the practice of our life experiences and how to make the best of that as we then relate with others. Right? So the relationship with God, our life experiences, and then how do we use that to the service, the benefit of those around us. Well, the very first place to go to is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3 to 7. So we have a God that cares. That's important. We have a God that loves us. We have a God that created us to be relational, to be to co-rule with each other this reality as God rules the cosmos, and He created us He empowered us to do so by bearing His image, by reflecting upon who we are and the way we should approach the world, His image, His presence, His nature. And as we go about the difficulties of life, God has not abandoned us to face the mess and, just be overwhelmed by it. God continues in compassionate, merciful, kind, engaging ways guide us through the horrible mess that we call life. And through our pain and suffering, he offers us thus comfort, peace, and maturity through and on the other side of those difficulties. In 2 Corinthians, Paul has been writing back and forth with the church in Corinth. Probably at least 3 letters, maybe 4. It's kind of fascinating rabbit hole there. But he's had several communications with them, and there's a harshness to some of the, like what we call 1 Corinthians, because of how distorted their community of faith was compared to what they were supposed to be. And if you remember some of the challenges, they had all kinds of issues. One of them was they would come together to, first day of the week, to have what we call the Lord's Supper. And it was probably a smaller gathering, and it was kind of at the end of a meal, which was meant to be what we call, fellowship dinners. Like it's meant to be a fellowship experience, yet they were using it to showcase the socioeconomic differences. So the rich, they were probably gathering at the house of somebody rich, otherwise you can't fit everybody, so that was already an issue. Then they were having these lavish meals. By the time a lot of the poorer servants that still had to work because society demanded it, by the time they would show up, a lot of the meal was already unfolding. They kind of then would just eat whatever was left, if not even had to bring their own. By the time they actually got to the Lord's Supper, many were drunk. Man, wouldn't that be a notable, lively Lord's Supper, right? They were drunk. Yeah, that's right. I go to church to drink. So they just have that. Not only that, they were, because of those socioeconomic differences, they were bickering at each other. They were choosing sides and divided loyalties. I'm of Paul, I'm of Peter. And they were using this to say, what the way we're living is right, you're wrong. They also were completely misunderstanding and abusing the concept of grace, to the point where some guy was sleeping with his stepmom, and they were all feeling progressive and proud about it.
Things haven't changed much, have they?
There's some that's might reflect some gatherings out there. So Paul writes them some very strong words about, what do you think you're doing? Kind of paraphrase. And then Paul had certain people go there and represent him, and apparently that was difficult. And through all that, like I said, that's why it seems like there's another letter in between somewhere, or something that's kind of the back end of 1 Corinthians. But there's some communication in between there that was then a little more tempered, and they didn't receive the first letter with very great enthusiasm. But this long back and forth really put a strain and really kind of pushed to the limit Paul's credibility and relationship with them and the other people that kind of went in between to help. But by the time he writes 2 Corinthians, or what we call 2 Corinthians, things were on the mends. There's a much more kind's not as if the first one was mean, but there's a different tone. It's much more relationally, like love and some praising and well done, and so there's some things that are on the mends, and it seems that they had dealt with that situation of the guy, stepmom, and all that, in more productive ways. So, with that in mind, because all that, I say all that because it's relevant to what we're about to read, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3 to 7. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves received from God. For just as we share abundantly in the suffering of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produced in you patient endurance on the same suffering we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our suffering, so also you share in our comfort. Okay, Paul's wordy, and at times he writes in ways that can seem repetitive. But here's a paraphrase. Here's what Paul's saying. This isn't just a generic statement. God comforts us because life is hard, and once you're comforted, go ye and comfort others. Also true. But that's not the generic. He's not approaching it in a generic way. He's talking about their struggles. Them as a community. Paul coming in, writing, trying to intercede, the tensions that came out of all that, the socioeconomic issues, the divided loyalties, the misunderstanding of grace, people getting drunk, we're better than you kind of concept, my spirituality is better than yours. Paul coming in there, the bickering, the back and forth, the stuff people said about Paul having to defend his apostle, that horrible relational mess, God was acting through that. God was intervening in that. The Lord's Supper played a role remembering how Christ has united us, how Christ brings us together. Paul connecting with them, guiding them, trying to correct them listening. Well, first not, but then them listening. Whoever the people that interceded, apparently Timothy and others kind of went and came back and forth. That whole process, on the other side of it, brought a community of faith that is more kind, compassionate, involved, forgiving, breaking through barriers like socioeconomic barriers, breaking through the rich, the poor. Like a lot of the tensions we see in the world out there, God in this community of faith brought a comfort through the tensions. And because God has done that, you, community of faith, can now go to the broken world and show them the comfort that God brought you by getting you to work through the problems and the issues and how that process went along. Does that make sense? So, do we have issues out there? Are there some societal problems? Are there some tensions between groups? Is there a socioeconomic divide? Are there some misuse of the whole I can do whatever I want? So the concept of grace, don't judge me. Is that still a thing? Come on, right? Of course it is. How do we solve that? Well, if you also pay attention to on kind of the public square, there's a lot of suggestions and voices unto that. Some think violence is the answer. Other thinks legislation is the answer. Other thinks we're going to just shame another group into doing what we want them. Others think, social media pressures, picketing and campaign. How would we solve those issues? Because once we come in these hollowed building, these hollowed halls, those things don't disappear just because you walk through the magical, divine gates of we call front door. All right, we still bring the tension, the struggles, right? But yet we're not yelling at each other, or at least not that I hear, right? We're not being violent towards one another. So, I mean, something is happening. And when brothers and sisters, families, teenagers, like when there are some tensions, how do we deal with that? Okay, God is guiding all that. And that gives us an experience of how things can work. So that gives us then the ability to go back out into the world. That's still a great tension with each other, with self, others, and so forth, and be a voice of comfort unto that mess. I think that's specifically what Paul is talking about. Now, generically also true, whatever mess you might have gone through in your life, some tragedies, some ups and downs, loss of loved one, whatever, and God then comforts you there. But how does God comfort us even through those moments?
With people.
Most likely, or most often with people. It would be wonderful if, life was going miserably and you just say a prayer and then a beam of light comes down from the heaven. First, let's make it more grand, right? It's a stormy day, the wind's blowing, and it's kind of dark and dreary, like a Monday in Oklahoma. And you're that's also reflecting kind of the stage of life you're in. It's hard, it's difficult, it's tragic, it's stormy, it's emotionally everywhere. All of a sudden you say a prayer, the wind just pauses, like leaves pause in midair, and then that dark and dreary just starts to, like the clouds kind of start rolling apart, a beam of light comes down from the heavens, and you just like, and it just kind of hits you, and then you just kind of float up into the air, and then you come back down, and life is better. Has that been anyone's experience? Or some variation of it? Yeah, okay. Yet God has comforted. I mean, I know some of your journey, so God has comforted. How has God comforted? Often with people that care, they love, they kind, they come, they share, they help, they engage, they mow your lawn. I mean, they give you money, they bring you a casserole through people. Okay, once you've experienced that, and God, through those experiences, those relational connections, and then God kind of also seems to line up some things, and in retrospect you're like, ooh, wow, that's fascinating. So God's got his finger and stuff going there. But so as that journey, it's not like that, as that journey from chaotic mess to a place of it's more manageable, you're more at peace, some things have resolved, seldom everything magically disappears, right? But there's been some resolutions. You feel a sense of kind of a little battered and bruised with some battle scars, but you feel stronger. Life starts to flow again. You can sleep again, you can laugh again. Okay, where you're at there, that's a place of comfort. Now, once we're there, how can we then be the type of people that participated in our journey towards comfort for others? That is an act of spiritual practice. That's a spiritual practice. One way Jesus put it is, new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. By this all will know that you're my disciples. So love one another. Okay, that's the same thing, just said differently. What you've experienced from God in Jesus, you now are going to go out and share with others. I don't know if you have ever taken for granted that you have a community of faith, what we call church, that cares and loves you. Let me guarantee you that is not the case for most. One of the things I do there at OC is we have a virtual program for people that are already working. So it's a work-based virtual program that you get one of two degrees, right? Kind of, there's a nursing track, and then there's a paraprofessional, in other words, a teacher. So a good part of that is virtual, except some of the clinical hours, that's got to be supervised, and then some of the hours you do at a school or so forth. One of the things that OC offers I think is kind of cool is there's program mentors, and I'm one of those, where we stay in touch with a certain amount of virtual students, even though they're not on campus, where then it's much easier to connect with students. I sit down and have a cup of coffee with students all the time. I'm virtually trying to do that. So we contact them, we send out little emails and texts. They're like, praying for you, how's it going? Da, 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 da. The stories I hear. And there's not a lot of people out there supporting a lot of these folks. Right? So once you experience something that is it's not common, you then can be that unto others. That's what Paul is saying. And now that God has navigated this horrible mess that you all call the church in Corinth, you can be an example and be that for others as the community of Corinth continued to be a horrible mess. Does that make sense? Thoughts? Good? Okay. God is, as we already many times have emphasized in Genesis, the very presence of God is transformative. Right? The very presence of God. One other way that is described and said is in Genesis chapter 50. This is the very end of Genesis. By this time, God has called out Abraham. Abraham has, gone through the whole thing there with Isaac, Ishmael, and that mess, and then Isaac. And then Isaac, has their kids. And then we got Jacob, and Jacob's kind of a shady character, but God works even through him. He goes out. He has to run away because his brother wants to kill him because he cheated his brother by lying to his dying father with the help of his mother. And you thought you had family issues, right? So Jacob has to run, and he runs to an uncle who is apparently runs in the family about the whole cheating and stuff and lying. He falls in love with Rachel and has to work 7 years, basically just room and board, free labor, because the boy's in love. And it says that those 7 years went by just like this. And then he gets to marry Rachel, only to find out that he wakes up with Leah, who's the older sister who had bad eyes. I don't know what that means. Is that like saying today, but she has a great personality? I don't know. So he wakes up with her, and that causes some issues, and then he gets to marry Rachel also, and then has to work another 7 years. I bet those next 7 years then go by as quickly as the first 7. And you can imagine the horrible mess between the sisters and all that. Okay. Then there's also the servant concubines. It's like kind of like wives, but not. I don't know. So he's in love with one, ends up with 4. The kids also obviously have some serious issues, and they don't get along very well. And Joseph is the 11th, the youngest by that point. Then there's Benjamin. They hate him. Everybody hates him. The boy apparently was kind of, like to rub it in. So long story short, you remember all that. He's sold into slavery. They move. Everybody eventually moves to Egypt because he becomes second in command. And there's a whole thing there with, it was a time of drought and all that. So they end up moving there. Okay. By the time Jacob dies, right, they already been there for a while. When Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he weeps. They're freaked out. He forgives them. He moves the whole family over there to best part of Egypt. The dad dies. And here's where we pick up in the story. Chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" You understand now this has been a while. They thought he's just been playing them, holding a grudge until the old man dies. Okay, who really was sold into slavery? Brothers enslaved themselves with their own shame and guilt when they sold poor Joseph, right? Teenage Joseph. So they lied. They send to Joseph news that his dad died, and that they make up that his last words, the dad's last words, were, "Make sure you forgive the boys." So when word reaches Joseph, Joseph is just freaked out. I mean, Joseph is shocked. Verse 19, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." Now, here's the really cool thing. The word translated harm and good is the same word in Hebrew, ra and tov, that is described the tree of good and evil in Genesis. So it's like here you have Joseph in front of the tree of good and evil, trying to decide what to do with it. And unlike Eve and Adam, he here reflects the presence of God, who is one of transformative. It's transformation. It's one of goodness, of kindness, of compassion. And he says that even when humanity, wink, wink, Eve and Adam, choose to do harm or take the fruit, God can still act through it. God can still bring goodness out of that horrible mess, which is really the unfolding of the story of the Bible, to be culminated in Jesus and to be continued in us. So the cool part is God is, from Genesis 1 forward, and many other illustrations of that same concept, about transformation, betterment, healing, peace, tranquility, life, light, and many other ways of saying the same thing. And if we have God, right? If we have God in Jesus, that's the presence we have in us. A transformative presence. Here's what it's not about: keeping us from any challenges. Keeping the raw, the evil, the challenge away from us. That's what we want him to do. But that is not what he does. What his presence does do is whatever raw comes our way, God will still use it for tov. God will still use it for good. I mean, you can relate if you're a parent. We try to keep our kids from, insulate them from all harm. And how long does that last? Yeah, until they're 16. Wow, I'm going to have to get some advice from you. Right, I mean, we try our best, but inevitably they're going to have to face some challenges, right? Otherwise they don't grow. You understand a baby that, all just sits there and like, isn't that called the happy baby pose or something in yoga? They just sit there. Okay. The reason the baby is happy baby pose is because the baby can't do anything else. Like, it doesn't have the muscle strength, the bone density. It's like a little turtle put on its back. Like, it's cute, but it's really sad. They can't do anything else. How do they learn to do more? Through tension, through having to, to feel the tension, the pressures, the difficulties, and it's that tension that creates the opportunity for good, productive things to come along. There is a saying, and I can't remember what, I remember if it's a Chinese saying. But the saying itself is, wisdom comes from crisis. Right? It's a life without difficulties, without tension, without struggles, without pressures, is a life we're not growing. We're not growing. I'd rather we grow without any of that, but that's just not how we grow. So God isn't going to keep all of it away. He's going to guide us through that journey, which is the essence of Romans 8:28, right? All things work for those that love the Lord. Caution, the timing of when you say that to people is important, right? Don't just throw that out at the darkest of moments. I know you mean well, but that isn't received well. But the point Paul is making there is, we live in a sucky world. But to those that love God, God is moving a plan along towards good. And you are in that plan. That does not mean because you're in a car accident and you lost a limb, God works all things out for those that love the Lord. Like, that's not what that specifically means. It's that you are in a transformative, restorative plan that is moving humanity towards good. And you get to be part of it. That might still mean horrible things happen here, but it is a journey towards good, and it's going to be complete on the other side of eternity because of what Jesus did. And it produces maturity along the way. So let's go to Ecclesiastes. It's a fun book. Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, verse 14. When times are good, be happy. Just put a pin there and let's close it and be done with it, right? But when times are bad, consider this. God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. Yeah, that sounds weird. Right? That sounds weird. I'm good with, like, when times are good, praise the Lord and be happy. You know? Just go for long walks on the beach and just hold hands and roll around in the fields of lilies, and you just, the smell of lavender. When that's your day, I just say roll with it and be thrilled. Here's the thing, though. When next day is quite one of those sucky days, it's not the time to then just go, crawl up in a little ball in the corner and suck your thumb and call for your mama. It's a time to be contemplative of, like, wait a minute. We live in a world of easier days, harder days, and that tension is, through that tension, God is doing some things. Because if you're under the illusion that following Jesus is nothing but like a fluffy existence, I would like to borrow your Bible, because that's not what mine says. Of the 12 apostles that followed Jesus, possibly John died of old age, everybody else murdered. Sign me up, Jesus, right? Like, yeah, I want to be an apostle. It's just a hard journey. But here's at least the way Ecclesiastes points it. There's something about that tension, right? Days that are easier. He's not talking about here good and evil, like good days and morally evil days. He's talking about easier days, hard days. And God has a role in both of those for purposes of teaching us something. And what he here highlights the teaching is that God is trying to teach us we have limits. When we just make all choices, right? We put our big boy pants on and we just start making adult choices and everything's just lining up beautifully. You know what that promotes? The illusion that you're in charge. God doesn't think that's a good illusion to have. So occasionally things they just shake up. And it's during those times that there's this painful yet necessary awareness of our own limitations and the need for something more. Isn't it in the face of tragedy that a lot of people talk about prayer and God and, that's what he's saying. So it's good for you and I to, from time to time, remember we're not in charge. Hopefully we don't have to have a lot of hard lessons for us to pick up on that. Right? Maybe just a little nudge on occasion is enough. Okay. James says something similar but less tragic. James chapter 1. James chapter 1, verse 2 to 4. My brothers and sisters. Chapter 1. That's why that makes sense. Chapter 1. Consider it a pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. I don't know if putting joy and trials on the same sentence is really the way most of us think, right? Like I said, we'd rather have an easier time. We wouldn't. But apparently, that isn't the best way we humans learn or grow or mature. And as trials come along, now there's a difference between trials and then what we think of temptations. James is going to make that distinction a little further down. But the difficulties, some hardships in life, apparently God has a hand in as teachable moments. As teachable moments. You ever been accused by your kids of slave labor when you get them to take out the trash or mow the grass or, pick up their socks? I think sometimes we're like that, prone to exaggeration and misunderstanding of what parents are what God is trying to do. So God is trying to guide us to maturity. And apparently part of how that happens is through challenges, difficulties. Because during those difficulties, we are then called to implement or apply or use our faith, our trust in God, our spiritual practices, our reliance on one another, being patient, kind, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in grace. All those things required to navigate the challenges of life help us grow. And the more we grow and persevere in that process, the closer and closer we are to the totality of what God created us to be. Wish there was an easier way, but apparently there isn't. So our experiences matter. They count, or they should. Otherwise, we just suffer for no good reason. We just suffer, we're broken, we're bitter, we're angry, we're whatever, distraught, we're violent. Nothing good came out of that. Now, once again, did God give my grandma cancer? I don't think that's where he wants us to go. If he wanted some specifics, he'd probably gone down that rabbit hole, but he doesn't. He just says that God uses challenges, whatever those are and however those come, for purposes of growing, right? Same thing. I don't think Joseph was making the point of, don't feel bad. God made you sell me into slavery. Ooh, God made you first almost murder me. I don't think that's what Joseph was saying at all. Okay? But he's saying that God somehow can still use that. All right. So some practices, and I got solid 5 minutes to talk about this. How are we going to put this into practice? In Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, Paul encourages the Philippians to, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Why?
When you're thinking about it, you can't think about bad things.
Yeah, there is something scientifically measured that what you focus on matters. If you focus on gratitude, it actually has physiological responses on your body. Like it makes a difference. If you focus on negative, bitterness, if you're just like conspiracy theory, not that that ever happens, but just a random, completely unassociated example with our modern times. If you just like put in, conspiracy theories galore, guess what kind of person you become?
Just be self-aware enough that you're getting into one of those negative loops that
Yes.
you gotta get out of it.
It's a loop that just drags you further and further down. That dark, it's the path to the dark side. Right? It's just going to lead you down that path. So, focus on some positives. What are some ways to do that? How about you actually make a list of some things? What are some people, places, sources of positive? What are then some places, people, sources of negative? How can we then go about our lives highlighting the positive and pushing out the negative, which might include a few folks in your life? How can we do one or the other? I'd write some of that down, see what that list looks like. So that's one approach. Another one is kind of the idea of gratitude. You can make a list of things you're grateful for. Sounds like stuff we tell kids, but it actually works. Once again, there's research that shows it. Make a list, focus on the positive, focus on the things you're thankful for. Another way to think of that is keeping some kind of journal where you're processing your day. I don't mean a diary. I mean, if Barry wants to keep a diary of like, I woke up this morning and I brushed my, mustache. That's fine. If you want to, yeah, you did. If you want to track your day, but I mean like a journal. It's just like a place for some reflection, some thinking through some things, just a few ideas. And as you think about how God is guiding you and has guided you through some stuff, how can you then come alongside others and do the same? Right? How can you? Yes.
There was given an exercise of write down 10 things you're thankful for the day,
Mm-hmm.
and then you write good things about 3 people that really bug you.
Yes. Or 3 prayers, right? Like you can say 3 nice. We often pray for people we don't like, but it's stuff like, God, may they burst in flames in the name of the Lord Jesus. Like, try to think of some good stuff, right? Kelly knows. Kelly's probably had a couple prayers like that. But
Your attitude will change about them.
yes, your attitude will change about them when you think of like, God, be kind and compassionate to them as they're probably struggling and they might have their own trauma and, so good. All right, so I leave you with some brilliant suggestions and trust and hope that you will go then and implement those. Next time, we're going to talk about relating with God through nature. It'll be whimsical and delightful. So come back, read Genesis 1 and 2. Thanks for being here.